Hi, welcome to my next lecture on the Queen's Gambit declined, and I want to talk about the Tarrasch defense, which is a little bit different than the defenses I've been talking about, the orthodox Lasker defenses. This one doesn't get as far along. All the other ones we sort of got to like move 6 for black, and then things really started happening. But on the Tarrasch, it sort of changes quickly, or from the beginning of the Queen's Gambit decline. Here, let me show you what I'm talking about. So the Queen's Gambit declined is d4, d5, c4, and then black plays e6, and this is my last lecture for moves where black plays e6. And then normally, well, actually, then white plays knight c3, going along with normal strategy where white once preparing to play e4. Now normally black would play f6, but the Tarrasch, black strikes immediately back at the center with c5. Maybe I should just talk a little bit about the basic strategy behind the Tarrasch. Well, like I said, c5 strikes back at the center, but the main objective from black is that he wants to get active piece play. And this is sort of important in sort of modern chess. Piece activity is very important. Sometimes it may be a good idea to sacrifice a pawn to get active pieces, because you really can't win a game without active pieces. So this is what this defense is doing. It's black wants to get some active pieces at the cost of a pawn weakness, and that pawn weakness is going to be an isolated pawn or hanging pawns. And like I said in a previous lecture, hanging pawns were these two pawns for black, could be for white also, are not supported by these two pawns. So basically you'll have these two pawns highlighted in green, and during the course of the game these two pawns on the E and B file will be exchanged off, so they won't be able to support these two pawns. So that's what the Tarrasch defense is. That's what's going to happen. That's black's goal. He's going to get a pawn weakness, but he's going to get more active pieces. So black just played c5. So how should white respond? Well, white is going to take on c takes d5, because it knows that well, actually, if you look at it, white could give black instantly an isolated pawn with some recaptures. We're going to capture, because now black is forced to recapture with the e pawn. Can't recapture the queen, or we just take the queen with the knight. So that's forced. Now white could instantly give black an isolated pawn by taking here, and then the bishop would recapture, and black would have an isolated pawn right there. Okay, so, but this is the main line in the Tarrasch, is just not to confuse anybody, was c5, c takes d5, e takes d5. And now white isn't going to take the pawn. It could if it wanted to, but the most common move is knight to f3. Because if you look at it now, if black decides to capture, we'll recapture with the knight, and our knight is somewhat centralized. There's now no pawns for to sort of poke away that knight in the center. So we're going to develop, and if black takes, we just take back, and black has an isolated pawn, and we have a centralized knight for the time being, which is an advantage to us. So obviously black is not going to take the pawn. Black is going to play knight to c6, developing a piece, not really threatening obviously to capture this pawn, because this pawn is right here is twice protected by the by the queen and knight. and twice attack, so black cannot win it. But black is developing a piece. And now, next move by white sort of may come as it's somewhat different than the normal strategy we've been looking at. And the other games we've been seeing where white will move this bishop and then move this pawn up, freeing this bishop to come to d3. Well, that isn't what's going to happen in the Tarrasch. Now, white knows that this pawn here is probably going to sit here and be isolated. So what it plans to do is to move this pawn up and move this bishop here, work and look along this diagonal, and then especially to this square and attack it. So that's its strategy. So white plays g3, and now black will develop the knight with knight to f6, also helping to stop e4 if necessary. White will play bishop to g2, continuing with its strategy. And now what does black do? What's the best move for black? Well, if you look at it, it needs to, control the center. It's trying to do that. We know it's going to get a pawn weakness for piece activity, and you can already tell that the bishops, all of black's pieces, can come out somewhat unhampered, unlike some of the previous variations which we've covered. So, if you look at it, which bishop should you develop first? You got to develop your pieces in castle. So black is actually going to play bishop e7 to develop its bishop and to aid in castling. Okay, I do want to cover before this though. I want to cover an interesting variation by white. I'm sorry, by black. So I already said before that in this variation, black's going to get an isolated pawn here. But there is a variation where we can get hanging pawns. I just want to show that real quick. So instead of black playing bishop to e7, black could play c takes d4, and then the knight has to recapture. And the queen comes to b6. Now we're threatening to win this knight here. So what is what is white to do? Well, it could move the knight back, and I guess we would have our isolated pawn, but the pawn can move forward. So white can choose in this instance, and it usually does, to capture this knight, and then black will recapture, and here we have our hanging pawns. So once again, white has the pawn weakness of the hanging pawns, but as you can tell, the bishops here, all the pieces are, you get active piece play. All these pieces are active for black. So let me back up to the previous variation, where black plays bishop to e7, preparing the castle. Now both sides will castle. And then what should white play? Well, the piece that hasn't been developed by white is the bishop. Sometimes this is a good way to know what you should do next. You look at this going, I don't know what to do. Should I move a knight, move a pawn? You got to tell yourself, hey, control the center, develop your pieces, castle. Sometimes you got to look at your pieces and go, I got to get them in the battle, so I got to develop all my pieces. That's one of the ways I look at playing, is that, hey, these rooks got to move to probably, the rooks are probably going to move to these two squares. So to get that, I got to develop the bishop, the queen, and move the rooks in. So it's you sort of know what to do. So white, the most common move is bishop to g5, and then black's going to actually capture this pawn. Or black's going to capture on d4. White will retake with the knight, obviously. And then black normally plays h6. sort of now. This is sometimes called poking the bishop, because now this poke here sort of tells you what black is saying. Hey, are you going to take the knight, or are you going to move the bishop back? I want you to tell me what your plans are with that bishop. That's what that poke does by moving this pawn forward. The only problem with moving that pawn forward sometimes is that now it's a target. So now the bishop can come back and maybe take this pawn with sacrificing and stuff. So it actually creates a target for white now, and attacking one of the pawns in front of the king. Well, that does it for this lecture.